Hey, it's Mike Canny again. Thanks for joining. And today we're going to look at another issue using Wireshark and NetData. This time what we're going to look at is what happens when we have packet loss in our network. Every network has packet loss. We have safeguards built into the protocol, specifically TCP with its congestion avoidance, flow control mechanisms built into it. But what does it really do to application end user experience when we do have packet loss within our infrastructure? Specifically, in this case, we're looking at a file transfer. And this specific issue we're going to look at was one that I ran into recently, and I've been able to recreate that same issue in my lab environment with my Apposite WAN emulator and a couple of systems on my local area network here in my lab. But what I've done is I was able to really replicate this same customer problem without using their data. So let's get into it. So what I've got here is a trace file that I've brought into Wireshark. And again, this was transferring a little over a 20 meg file. And in this case, the network conditions that were configured was roughly a 25 megabit per second wireless network and about 2 milliseconds of round-trip latency. And intermittent packet loss emulating burstiness or congestions on the network. So as we kind of drill into this, you can see I've brought this into this specific PCAP file into Wireshark. And so how do we go about troubleshooting this in Wireshark? So one of the first things I do when I get a trace file is just kind of very quickly scroll through it and look for anything that pops out at me. And you can see that we do have some retransmissions here. You can kind of see the bar graph here, or this what I call the barcode on the right hand side, indicating that things are not going well. As we kind of investigate here, we see some triple duplicate acknowledgments, as well as some fast retransmissions. We also have some selective acknowledgments within this trace. But really, all in all, again, this doesn't look horrible on the outside. There are some issues, etc. But overall, nothing really hugely jumping out at me in my quick scroll through within Wireshark. So one of the things that I'll do also, especially if it's reported that there's poor performance, in this case specifically with a file transfer, it's taking a long time over the network, we need more bandwidth, etc., etc. What I'll do is I'll graph this out in TCP trace. So if I go here to statistics and TCP stream graphs, and then click on specifically this time sequence TCP trace, this is going to give us a very nice breakdown of the TCP segments out on the wire, and also allow us to see where there are points where the sequence numbers aren't accelerated, and you can see here we're kind of flatlined a little bit to about close to 20 seconds into the file transfer, and then we have this big burst of data where we're sending a lot of data out on the wire, and then we have kind of another little lag period here, and then this another burst out on the wire. So one of the things we can do is we can zoom into this to kind of get a little more granular view of each one of those typical bursts. It gives me a good indication, right? Again, I can see how much offered load was out on the network. And again, I can see in the beginning it was very low, then a big chunk of data, then another drop off, and then another chunk of data. But that's about as deep as we can get from a graphical perspective within Wireshark. So, oftentimes you've probably, if you've seen some of my other videos that I have on the YouTube channel, highlighting the power of NetData, it's one of the tools that I have just come to rely on almost as second nature. And I love Wireshark, a lot of great features in it. But when I'm firefighting a problem and on a Tiger team with 25 other people for a customer, I want to solve that problem as quickly as possible. So that's when I bring the trace file into NetData. So here I've brought that same PCAP into NetData, and one of the first places I typically will look is in the dialog chart. And the dialog chart is going to have our clients on the left-hand side, our servers on the right-hand side, and again, I'd filtered this trace down just to the workstation and the server, 150 and .2. And one of the things that jumps out right away is this big red line. Now these lines are color-coded based on retransmission rate. So, you know, we're under 1% packet retransmission within this trace. So again, it's not a huge, heavy, you know, tons of packets being dropped. Only, you know, 1% or just less than 1%. This may be pretty typical in some environments. So the next thing I want to do is come in and chart out the application transaction. So I'll go up here and click on this chart transaction window, and I'm going to go ahead and clear all the data that's already loaded. And so again, what this does is it's plotting out each and every transaction. In this case, you know, we have some NetBIOS queries. We have this long-running transaction, and if we look at this is just for a single write of 16 kilobytes. So it's not a lot of data, but yet it took, I guess in this case, 23.84, so almost 24 seconds for this single write to complete. And you can see also another bunch of these writes that are taking anywhere between 3 and 4 seconds to complete. And then we have this band of very fast writes. So if I mouse over that, you can see these are right around 14 milliseconds to complete, extremely fast writes. And then another series of these writes that are taking a bit longer. Here's one that's almost 2 seconds. And then this other band here of writes that are, again, completing very quickly. So the next step here is to actually drill in and look at the packet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in the packet timing chart. And this is, again, another one of my favorite graphs within NetData, because it allows me to see a graphical representation of that PCAP trace. So I can actually look at the packets in a graphical perspective. And again, as I kind of expand this window out, we've got our timeline from left to right that's showing this file transfer. It took a little over 40 seconds. And each one of these different pastel bands represents a different TCP connection. We can see we have one main TCP connection and a whole bunch of these purple and red boxes. Well, what are those? Well, the red boxes are packet loss, so that data was lost in transit, and the purple are selective acknowledgments and data retransmissions. And again, if we zoom into this, we can get a more granular view and actually see where those retransmissions occurred. Now, the other cool thing you might be noticing as we drilled in, we've got some other colors in here where this pink is showing that this is retransmission delay. So what NetData does, it takes the entire transaction and breaks it out and tells you how much of this is network, how much of this is retransmissions, how much of this is due to latency, how much of it's due to server processing time. So each one of these different colors is indicative of where the delay was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out totally to my full zoom, and we're going to come into this connection, right click on it, and say show me the flow chart of this connection. So if you remember back to that TCP timing chart that we looked in, the TCP trace chart within Wireshark, this is like a TCP trace chart on steroids. You can see we've got our similar stepping of the TCP segments along with the relative data size and sequence numbers, as well as a bunch of other markers in here. We've got all kinds of information that's going to lead us to what caused the performance problems. Now, you'll also note that we've got a lot of these little red hashes. Those red hashes are packet loss. So every time we had a drop, we get a red hash. So these are plotting out individual packets, individual segments, TCP segments on the wire, and you'll see these numbers above those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of zoom into this spot here. And what those numbers represent is the number of TCP segments that are out on the wire. So our in-flight data, our unacknowledged data at that time. And so one of the things you can see is we're kind of ramping up. TCP is kind of ramping up to, in this case, to 6 segments. We have a selective acknowledgement that occurred at this point, but also due to a drop packet. And then what you can see is TCP is kind of stepping off. It's going back to 2 segments on the wire, and then jumping up to 3 segments on the wire. We have more packet loss, and we go back to 2 segments on the wire. So even though we only had less than 1% of total retransmissions in this trace, you can see what that's actually doing to our throughput. As I mouse over this yellow bar here, we can see that we only had 2,920 bytes in flight at that given time. I'm going to go ahead and pin that window there. And so that's all we're getting from a throughput or from a bytes in flight during this specific time frame. And if I look up here at this purple line, the purple line is the receive window from that client. So we can see that the TCP receive window is 63,577 bytes, but yet we're only allowed to put out 2,920. So by looking at this yellow in-flight data and comparing that to what our receive window is on the other side, in this case the client, we can see that we're nowhere near what that client is capable of accepting. And again, the reason we're not is because of the TCP congestion avoidance, right? Some of the pieces in there to some of the built-in abilities of TCP to patrol itself on how much data it can send and how much the network can handle, keeps our throughput really, really low. And in fact, if I come in, I can ask NetData to tell me what our data throughput is, and I come in here and replot that. We can see that our data throughput is a megabit. We bounce up here a little bit to almost 2 megabits per second. And again, this is 25 megabit per second link. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom back out to the full chart. So as we look at this as a whole, we can see that our in-flight data, when there is no packet loss, 864,000 bytes on the wire. And we can also correlate during that time the large burst of TCP segments out on the network, as well as our throughput up to around 30 megabits per second. And again, I said this connection was 25 megabits per second. That's kind of an estimate of what the bandwidth is. This was actually done over a wireless link that's around between 25 to 50 megabits per second, again with the packet loss injected into it with my WAN emulator. But again, you can see once we start having the packet loss again, we go from 3 segments to 7 to 2 to 2 to 5 to 1 to 4 to 1 to 1 to 4, and our throughput bottoms out, right, as TCP backs off and controls the amount of data that's on the wire due to the packet loss. So you can see, we dropped from 30 some megabits per second down to about 1, 2, maybe 3 megabits per second, and then we burst back up when the packet loss is resolved or the congestion is resolved, and we get our same throughput, full use of the network. So again, this was just kind of a quick look at a problem that I've run into recently, and I think this illustrates very well what even less than 1% packet loss can do to your throughput, can do to your applications, can do to your end users' performance. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hope to catch you next time. Thanks.